Hey pals, I'm here today to talk about the 2023 Booker Longlist, which was announced today when I'm filming. So, I planned a predictions video for the 2023 Longlist, and I actually filmed it a few weeks ago. And then as soon as I'd finished filming it, I was annoyed and just felt like I wanted to change a few of my predictions, and just decided to not upload a predictions video because, in all honesty, I had my predictions list on a piece of paper on my desk, and whenever I was at work, I work from home, so whenever I was at work, I'd see this piece of paper out the corner of my eye and just kept thinking, oh no, maybe I'd swap that for that, maybe I don't think that. And I couldn't stop changing my predictions, so I just thought there's no point in me making an actual official predictions list, and so I just scrapped that. And also, I fear that when I upload a predictions video, it makes viewers think that I plan to read the long list. And the last few years I have planned to read the long list, but I've never done it because I get all excited and then I see the actual long list and I have this big crashing disappointment, and then I decide not to bother with it because they don't look like they're suitable for my tastes. This year that has not happened. So I think by not doing a predictions video, it has somehow resulted in there being a long list I'm actually really excited for, and I'm happy to read all of these books. So very briefly, I'm just going to talk about a couple of books that I have read and really wanted to see make the long list that aren't there. Just like an honourable moment for them because I feel that they deserve to be there. On my predictions list, the sort of one I end up with that I didn't make any more changes to, I only made two correct predictions, and one of those was one I'd also read and was hoping would make it. But there are another two that I was hoping to see there. And I think the most obvious book that has not made the long list, that I think a lot of people thought would make the long list, is of course Burnham Wood by Eleanor Catton. I loved this book. This and the next book I'm going to show you are sort of in line with one another for my favourite book of the year. I think they're both brilliant. Eleanor Catton was sort of automatically submitted because of you've previously, I think, been longlisted. You're like an extra submission for your publisher. So they would have definitely read this book, but they decided not to include it. That makes me excited to see what all the other books are like, because they obviously think they're all better than this one. But yeah, sad to see it not make it. She has previously won, so it's not, the most devastating situation for her. And the next one is a debut novel, and that is Carla by Colin Walsh. I thought this was absolutely fantastic. There were so many brilliant Irish books that could have made the list this year. 4 have made it, but Carla is not one of them. Again, Colin Walsh is really early in his career. This is a debut novel, so he's got plenty more shots at making the long list, but this would have been a book I'd have been really happy to see there because I really loved it. But I will be doing a full-length review on this one shortly. So, which book did I actually hope was going to make it and did? Rather than do this in the order of like alphabetical order, the way they're on the website, I'm not going to do that because you can just go look at the website for that. So instead, this video is going to be a reaction to how I feel about the long list and my plans. So I'm going to talk about the books in the order that makes the most sense to me. So, apologies. The one I had read and also wanted to make the long list and included on my predictions and did make it is A Spell of Good Things by Ayobami Adebayo. I think this book is a really brilliant book, completely deserves to be there. It's one I'm not surprised to see there because it just felt really, as soon as I finished it, I just thought that this feels like a Booker book. So yeah, glad the judges agree. I'm excited to see more people read this because I feel like I thought I was going to see so many people read it after how many people adored her first novel. And I think because this one is a lot denser and a lot harder to get through, not as many people have picked it up as I expected, so I think it will give this book a really great boost. So really enjoyed this one, think it deserves to be there. The next one that I predicted but didn't really want to be on there but thought would is The House of Doors by Tan Tuan Eng. I can't say his name, I always want to add a G to Tuan. Tan Tuan Eng. So I thought this would make it to the long list because this is this author's third novel and both of his previous novels have been longlisted. So he is now an author who's had every book he's ever written longlisted with a Booker Prize. That's a pretty good achievement. And yeah, there was a lot of anticipation for this one. There's been a 10-year gap between his previous novel and this one. And I read both of his previous novels the year they came out, so a long time ago. I was probably a teenager at that point. And so I was really anticipating this one, but I was unsure if I would enjoy it because my tastes have changed a lot as a reader since then. And I actually DNF'd this one. I got about 150 pages through it, which is probably nearly halfway. The writing style just doesn't work for me at all. And so I'm going to give you a sample. I talk about all my DNFs over on my Patreon. So if you're ever interested in hearing about which books I DNF'd, I talk about them in great detail once a month. And usually I include excerpts, like if the writing style is a reason for me not carrying on, I include an excerpt to illustrate why it didn't work for me. Now, House of Doors is one of those books where I can see why this writing style would work for loads of people. Some of you will hear me read this and think, that sounds great, what's the problem? This type of writing style for me is so over the top, sort of weirdly formal and stilted, and yeah, just almost a bit cringy in how overwritten it is. So here we go. The silence around us, the very weave of the night itself, felt denser. Even the waves outside, fraying away the margins of land since the beginning of the world, seemed to have stilled into stone. In the hallway, the weighted heart of the grandfather clock went on beating, as indifferent as an aged monk thumbing his prayer beads on their long and infinite loop. "Where does the story begin, Willie?" I asked. For a while he did not say anything. Then he shifted in his chair. "Where does a wave on the ocean begin?" he said. "Where does it form a welt on the skin of the sea to swell and expand and rush towards shore?" "I want to tell you a story, Willie," I said. Yes, I thought to myself, tell him your story, let him write it, let the world know. The music I had just played seemed to go on unspooling in the air between us, this song that had no beginning and no ending, the song of time itself. No, it's so over the top. It makes it seem like everything within the book is unbearably epic. It's just not for me. So I'm tempted to finish this one just for the sake of the long list. Let me know, like, if you are intrigued to see me read the long list. Are you fine with me just DNFing ones that don't work for me, or do you think it'd be interesting for me to finish it to see if the plot ends up being stronger than the writing style? I don't know. So there's that one. So on to the exciting bit, which is talking about the 6 books that were already on my TBR and that I was planning to read, regardless of if they made the long list. And in all honesty, quite a few of these I wouldn't have thought would make the long list, because from the blurb that I read, they just didn't sound very like bookerish. And that's because a couple of these are like coming of age narratives, which I don't think historically do super well on the Booker. I'm thinking of Adele for the time being one within its year. But I can't think of loads of sort of coming of age narratives that have made the long list. If you don't know, coming of age narratives and family dramas are like some of my favourite themes within books, and there are a lot of books that focus on those themes in this year's long list. I'm very happy with that. So the first one, and this is one of the ones that I think a lot of people have never heard of, is Pearl by Sian Hughes. Now this is a bit of a bizarre one for me because I would never have heard of this book, but I heard a few people talking about the book Reamble by Priya Hine and saying they thought it would make the long list, and when I looked into it, I thought it sounded great, so I asked my library to buy a copy. And when I was asking them to buy a copy, you have to write like the ISBN, the publisher, and I thought, I've never heard of this publisher, I'm going to go have a look into them. And so I did, and they had published Pearl by Sian Hughes. And I read the description and thought, that sounds like a completely me book. And bearing in mind, the last few weeks I've been requesting books from the library that I think will make the book a long list. Not done a very good job of it. But I've been requesting all these books. I really didn't think this would have a chance of making the book a long list because it is about a young girl coming of age in a small rural community. Her mother, I think, has died, and she is trying to like figure out her past and her memories and what happened to her mother. This is supposed to be very like slice of life and very lyrically written. All those things sound amazing to me. I just didn't think it sounded like a Booker Prize book. But I allowed myself to request it, even though I didn't think it would make the Booker Prize. And I was like, oh, you're going to have to try and squeeze this in around all these other books. But it just sounded like such a me book. I had to request it. So I was so happy to see this one on the long list. The next couple I actually saw in Waterstones on the new releases shelves when I was browsing. And I buy very few books now. I only really buy books from authors when I previously loved their work. And everything other than that I request from the library. So I had checked and my library had a copy of each of these. So I'd added them to my library TBR list. I have lots of different TBR lists, but I have one on my library app, which is all the books I want to read, that my library also has copies of. And these two fell into that category. The first one being All the Little Bird Hearts by Victoria Lloyd Barlow. Again, very excited to read this one, and just really glad that these books that were already on my TBR have been given a boost, because my library TBR is about 150 books long. So, you know, it's really hard to pull books to the top of it. So I'm really glad to see that I'll be reading these ones quicker than I would have otherwise. In this, we follow a neurodiverse woman who is a mother, and she lives with her daughter Dolly, and she lives a very strict and rigid life where she does certain things on certain days of the week, and a couple move in next door who very quickly break all of her rules, that become sort of an extended part of the family, and, you know, really adored by the mother and the daughter. But there is a darkness overhanging the narrative, because it says that the mother has something this married couple want, which is a child. So yeah, just even without that final like eerie bit, I really like the sound of this. But the fact that it is this sort of, you know, family sort of coming of age story with this darkness hanging over it just sounds perfect. And the next one that I saw in Waterstones and then saw that my library had is Western Lane by Chetna Maru. This is a young girl coming of age story. Of course I wanted to read it. It says this is a moving debut novel about grief, sisterhood and a teenage girl's struggle to transcend herself and squash. So we follow an 11-year-old girl who is being trained in squash by her father, and when her mother dies, he puts her under this really brutal training regimen, and you sort of follow her story from there. When I was a young girl, probably around this young girl's age in the book, my dad played squash, and I remember sometimes he would go and play squash while I was roller skating at our sports centre. They used to have like a 2-hour block on a Saturday where kids could go roller skate, and I loved it. And my dad used to go and play squash, and I remember sometimes me finishing before him and going to wait in the room where he was playing squash and just thinking it looked like the most terrifying sport of all time. I am really bad at sport, but in particular I'm very bad at, like, I don't know, like, what do you call it? Like, judging where something flying towards me is going. Really bad at anything like, you know, tennis, squash, badminton, and those things scare me. But squash is like that on like crack. It's insane. Like, it's incredibly scary, like in closed space with this ball just flying around really hard. So yeah, the idea of an 11-year-old being trained in that is pretty scary to me. Very intrigued to see how this novel goes. Then we have In Ascension by Martin McInnes. I actually borrowed this one from the library a couple of months ago. I don't often read books like this anymore. I used to read a lot more books like this, sort of like sci-fi, literary fiction novels, and really enjoy them. And yeah, I've just sort of fallen out of the habit. But I quite like the sound of this. This has some sci-fi elements that I think touch on climate change, and I think one of the characters in this book studies the ocean. Again, this is about a family, and yeah, I borrowed it from the library. I read the first couple of pages, was intrigued, but I had too many books up from the library and somebody requested this book back, and I knew I wasn't going to read it in the few days I had left. So I returned it, but still had it on my list as one to pick back up. So this is now giving me an excuse to do that sooner rather than later. And if you are a part of my Patreon on the book club tier, we are reading this book together this month. I thought it would be fun to read one of the Booker Longlist books, because I know a lot of my patrons look at the Booker Longlist as well. And so this is the one we've selected because quite a few people were hoping to read this one. I do spoilery videos at the end of each month about the book we read, but we also have a Discord where we chat about anything, but we have a thread each month for the book we are reading. So if you are part of my Patreon, remember to join the Discord, because it's really nice to chat over there about the books. And then I had 2 more on my TBR that were like a little bit more tentative, and that's because I heard mixed reviews. So one of those is If I Survive You by Jonathan Escoffrey. Now, in all honesty, I didn't know this was eligible because it's being described as an interlinked short story collection, and short stories aren't eligible, but based on people's reactions who've read it, I think this is more like a novel than it is a short story collection. I love novels and short stories. In particular, I love ones that are a mixture of both, so I'm absolutely fine with that. So I've heard some good things about this. I also think it sounds great, like it sounds like the sort of book I could really enjoy. But then I've had quite a few people review it on BookTube who say that it had some really great themes, but it just didn't like pull together as a narrative, and they were ultimately disappointed. So it was one I had on my TBR because it sounded interesting to me, but one I was like, I'll wait to hear a few more people talk about because I'd heard a few negative reviews. So this opens in 1979 as political violence consumes native Kingston, and we follow these two brothers as they flee to Miami, but they will soon learn that the welcome in America will be far from warm. It says, as both brothers navigate the obstacles littered in their path, an unreliable father, racism, a financial crisis, and Hurricane Andrew, they find themselves pitted against one another. Will their rivalry be the thing that finally tears their family apart? So yeah, very intrigued by that one. This next one I'd only heard about because of my library, so I logged into my library app probably about 5 times a day, in all honesty. I'm obsessed with it. And on the front page of my library app, they show all the new fiction and non-fiction books they've just purchased. And this book came up, and I was immediately drawn in by the cover and the title, which is Study for Obedience by Sarah Bernstein. And I read about it and thought it sounded really intriguing, so was immediately going to request it, to borrow it. But then I looked on Goodreads and saw that it had like a pretty bad average rating. I think it was sitting at like lower than 3.40, which is pretty low. And so I decided to not request it yet because I had, like I say, way too many books already borrowed and already requested. But it was one I was aware sounded like it could be a bit bookerish, so I probably should have requested it, but I didn't. This is about a woman whose brother asks her to move to a remote northern town to be his housekeeper, but soon after she gets there, lots of bad things start to happen, and the rural community start to think that she might be the reason for all these bad things happening. It says she feels their hostility growing, pressing at the edges of her brother's property. Inside the house, although she tends to her brother and his home with the utmost care and attention, he too begins to fall ill. So this sounds really dark. When I read some of the reviews on Goodreads, positive and negative, some of the reasons some people had really enjoyed it is because this is really focused on the sort of minutiae of everyday life, very much slice of life, really slow, almost plotless. Some people loved that, more people hated that. I'm absolutely fine with plotless novels that focus on really small details. So this sounds like a book I could really enjoy, so I'm happy to have an excuse to read it sooner rather than later. And then we have 2 books that I'd heard of but wasn't planning to read unless they made the booker, but now they're on the booker, I'm happy enough to give them a go. The first one being This Other Eden by Paul Harding. I saw this one on quite a few people's predictions list. So this is inspired by real historical events. It's based on a real island that I hadn't heard of. It opens in 1792 when the formerly enslaved Benjamin Honey arrives on the island with his Irish wife. More than a century later, their descendants remain, but there is an intrusion of officials who are determined to cleanse the island, and so you follow the story of this cleansing. Hearing mixed reviews, but I'm intrigued enough by the premise of this one. And then we have Old God's Time by Sebastian Barry. I'm going to be completely honest, when I initially saw this one on the long list, I was disappointed because I think Days of That End was previously on the long list, and I think that's why I read it. It's the only book I've read by him and I didn't enjoy it. From memory, I DNF'd it halfway through, and I think I DNF'd it because I didn't like the plot. I think I was okay with the writing. I think I felt quite distant from the characters, and I also didn't really like the focus of the plot. I'm not massively into westerns, in all honesty. So when I saw this one, I was like, oh, Sebastian Barry book, like I can probably force myself to read it. But I had no idea what it was about. So then I read the blurb and I was like, I'm looking forward to this one. Like, if I didn't know this was Sebastian Barry and I read this blurb, I would want to read this book. It says, recently retired policeman Tom Kettle is settling into the quiet of his new home, a lean-to annexed to a Victorian castle overlooking the Irish Sea. Sounds great. For months he has barely seen a soul, catching only glimpses of his eccentric landlord and a nervous young woman who has moved in next door. Occasionally fond memories of the past return, of his family, his beloved wife June and their 2 children. But when 2 former colleagues turn up at his door with questions about a decades-old case, one which Tom never quite came to terms with, he finds himself pulled into the darkest currents of his past. Love it. Love a literary fiction with like a dark mystery element. Love that it's set in like a little lean-to on a castle overlooking the sea. Sounds very atmospheric. This sounds like a book I could really enjoy. And then finally, there was 3 books I hadn't heard of. One of them hasn't come out yet, and that's the only book out of all of these books that my library doesn't have a copy of, which is amazing. It felt so great to type all these in and come back and say, we have this already, so great. I mean, I hope you're in the same situation if you are trying to get hold of these from your library, but if you're not, you can ask your library to purchase a copy. I use an online form to do that, but you can also, I am told by lots of librarians who watch the channel and are super helpful, that you can go into the library and go up to the desk and ask the librarians. And I have asked them to buy lots of books and they always do. And recently they've started to accept my requests in like 5 days. It is just a great feeling. And yeah, I highly recommend you do it. So And the 3 are The Bee Sting by Paul Murray, Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, which is the one they didn't have and I've asked them to buy, and How to Build a Boat by Elaine Feeney. I think all of these sound pretty intriguing. The Bee Sting is the only really sort of long book to make the list. It's around 650 pages, which is interesting because this is the year when people thought there could be loads of chunky books on the long list because of a lot of the really popular chunky books that have come out this year. I enjoy long books. A lot of the books on this long list are around 250 pages. Funnily enough, I worked out how many pages I need to read a day between now and the shortlist being announced to manage to read the 11 books I haven't, and I need to read 72 pages a day, which isn't too bad. And that's because most of them are quite short. So this is one of the long ones. In Ascension is also quite long, but having borrowed that from the library before, the font is quite widely spaced. It's not actually that big a book. This is a family drama, which I love. I have this one on the list of ones I may not enjoy because I think this is supposed to be quite comical. It's described as a brilliant tragicomic saga, and humour is so specific that I think it's really hard to find, you know, humorous books that work for me. But this is about a family, and each individual member of this family, the mother, the father, and the teenage son and 12-year-old daughter, all have these things happen that are sort of ruining their lives, and it's about like what happened to this family to make everything go so wrong. So yeah, this one could be either brilliant or just entirely not for me, so we shall see. Prophet Song is set in Ireland. It opens on a dark wet evening in Dublin when a scientist and a mother of 4 answers the front door to find the GNSB on her doorstep, 2 officers from Ireland's newly formed secret police who want to speak with her husband. It says things are falling apart, Ireland is in the grip of a government that's taking a turn towards tyranny, and as the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, Ailish finds herself caught within the nightmare logic of a collapsing society, assailed by unpredictable forces beyond her control and forced to do whatever it takes to keep her family together. So yeah, I think this one's going to be pretty dark and bleak, but I think it sounds really interesting. Always interested in following mothers, matriarchs, so yeah, this one sounds like it could be really good. And then we have How to Build a Boat by Elaine Feeney. Also hadn't heard of this one, but it sounds like a coming of age story I'd really enjoy. We follow a young 13-year-old boy who is on a mission to do 2 things: build a perpetual motion machine and to connect with his mother who died before he was born. It says at his new school, where all else is disorientating and overwhelming, he finds 2 people who just might be able to help him. I love narratives that include a school setting because I find that quite often when you read a book that has young children in it, even if you're following the young children, it's sort of like a cutscene, like you're told they go to school, but the narrative happens when they're at home or just not at school. I always really love a book where you're actually in the classroom or in the playground, and I think this book is going to be quite focused on that setting, so very excited to read it. So those are all the books. Like I said, I'm planning to read all of them. Most of them I'm very excited for. There's a few unsure about, and you know, just haven't heard anyone review those last 3, so I have no idea what to expect. One of the things people are commenting on is, like I said, a lot of short books, which will make them easier to read. Another thing is that there are 4 books by Irish authors on the long list this year, which makes Ireland, based on the size of the country with the most authors making the long list. I think it's like 39 authors in total or something like that, so it's pretty great. There's so much amazing fiction coming out of Ireland, and one of the reasons for that is because Ireland are really great at supporting their authors. There is a lot of funding for authors to help them write their books, and it's just really great to see. I work in research funding at university. I specialise in medical research funding, but some of my colleagues obviously work in the arts and humanities department, and funding for literature and just the arts in general is really thin on the ground. And you know, as you've probably heard, lots of departments, literate art departments in the UK universities are struggling with having more and more sort of internal funding taken away from them. So it's just really great to see that Ireland is doing it the right way, and that these authors are being published more and being read more and making long lists like this and being celebrated more. So yeah, really happy with the long list. Have requested them all at the library. I'm the first in the queue for most of them because most of them are so unknown. So hopefully they'll start coming in soon. Pearl's already waiting for me because, like I said, I requested that a while ago. So that will probably be the first one I read, and just can't wait to start chatting to you all about them. I would love to know what your plans are, which ones you'd heard of, which ones you're sad to see not making the list. which ones you're happy to see did make it. Any of your thoughts, be interested to hear them down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.